Welcome to Syntax, a Generative Introduction, 4th edition. My name is Andrew Carnie. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona. I'm the author of your textbook, and I'll be leading you through this series of video tutorials. So this is our final video on ditransitives and phenomena related to them. Now we've argued in previous videos that the structure of double object constructions involves a bifurcated structure where there is a voice phrase that introduces the agent and a V position that introduces the goal and the theme, and that we have an operation of short verb movement which takes the V and moves it into the voice and gives us the correct surface order: Morag gave Clay a book. Now, in the second video we talked about how there are issues around treating this position as the complement of the verb as the accusative case position. So we argued separately that there is an additional projection in the tree that we called Agaro. It's called Agaro because in lots of the world's languages it shows up as marking object agreement. And on the basis of data from Irish, we showed that there's evidence that the theme argument is placed into the tree in precisely the place we've been putting it all along. Down here is the complement of the verb, but this is not the accusative position. Instead, the accusative position is leftward shifted. So it's shifted into this position here, where accusative case is. And of course, we've argued several times that external agents are generated by voice phrase. The reason to put them in voice phrase is because sometimes they're missing in, for example, passives. And so agents are generated in this position, and then of course they shift up to the TP for case and EPP reasons. So we've argued for shifted objects that there's a position right here higher than the base position of the verb where objects shift into. Now we're going to come back to the issue we argued for before this particular tree, because what we haven't explained is what happens when we have this interaction of arguments. So we've argued this object has shifted to the left. That would place it in the wrong position relative to this goal, and we haven't explained how the goal gets any case. So we need to capture those kinds of relations as well. Before we get into those double object constructions, first of all, I want to talk about other kinds of double object verbs or ditransitive verbs. So the verb tell is an interesting one. The verb tell has both a theme and a proposition CP. So I told Bill that Susan left, for example. So what do we have? We have our usual active theta grid, which introduces the agent DP in its specifier, as indicated by the underline, and it takes an Agaro P, because active verbs can take an object element. That's Bertziau's generalization, you will remember. If you have an agent, you can assign accusative case. And then tell introduces the theme, which is I told Bill. Bill is the theme. That, blah, 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 is the proposition. So what would a tree for Ramona told Brandon that Kimberly drives an SUV? It would look like this. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but don't panic. It's all right. So we're generating the theme here in the specifier of the VP, and the complement is the complement proposition. Brandon undergoes object shift into the specifier of Agaro P in order to get accusative case, as we've argued elsewhere. To get the word order right, the verb has to do short verb movement into the voice head. It doesn't go any further. It doesn't go V to T movement, but it does go this far. And that will get us told Brandon that Kimberly drives an SUV. And the top of the tree is the same as what we've seen before. The agent is generated in the specifier of the voice phrase and moves into the specifier of the T for case and EPP reasons. So that's tell. Let's look at another case. Let's look at put. Put is different in that instead of having a CP complement, it has a PP complement. So this is the structure for Brianna put the mug on the counter. Just to sort of deal with it right off the front, the voice phrase introduces the agent Brianna, and that DP can get case in this position, so it moves to the specifier of TP. It also moves there for EPP reasons. Downstairs, what we have is an Agaro P and a VP. The Agaro P is licensed because we have an active voice. And the VP is different from the tell case in that instead of having a CP in the complement position, we have a PP. Notice that this PP is drawn in as a complement rather than an adjunct, and that's because it's an argument. So remember, you never put adjuncts in theta grids, but clearly it's the case that put the mug on the counter. On the counter is a required argument. It doesn't have the properties of an adjunct. So we're putting it in here as a complement. All right, the second thing we'll notice here is that our theme is put in the specifier of the VP. And this is not a case position, so it's going to have to move. It moves from this position into the specifier of Agaro P, just as we have argued for other kinds of verbs that have an accusative case. So that movement happens. To get the right word order, we have to do short verb movement of the V to the Agaro to the voice phrase, and that will get us our correct order. Brianna put the mug on the counter. Okay, now let's turn to what we do with verbs like give. We need to get accusative case onto both the object of the verb, the theme of the verb, and onto the indirect object or the goal of the verb. And in our previous tree for these double object constructions, we hadn't really talked about how we get the case on those elements. But the solution lies in front of us here. We see a pattern where we have effectively an element that introduces a theta role, so like the voice phrase here, or the VP here. And we have a position where the case of the argument is licensed. So for the agent, that position is the specifier of the TP, and for the object, the element is the specifier of the Agaro P. Well, what do we do when we have three arguments? Well, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have an element that introduces the theta role, and we will have a functional category like Agaro that will license it in terms of case. So, where do goals come from? We've argued that agents are introduced by voice, and we've argued that themes are introduced by verbs. But where are goals come from? Well, one possibility that's been suggested is that we in fact have another kind of thing that's like voice. We can call this the applicative phrase. And the name applicative comes from properties of various languages around the world. We'll look at an example in a moment where there seems to be a link between a functional item and a goal. So there's a link between particular morphology and the presence of goals. And this morphology is often called the applicative morphology. The head we're going to use for applicatives is called Appl, standing for applicative. Now we also are going to need to be able to license the case on indirect objects. With verbs like put, that's relatively straightforward. We have a PP that can do it. But verbs like give, when they're used with a double object, like I gave Mary the book, there isn't such an obvious place to put Mary in order to get case. So we can propose, actually, that just like there's Agaro, which is for object agreement, there's AgrIO, which stands for indirect object agreement. And this element, AgrIO, is in fact where the accusative case on goals is licensed. All right, let's talk for a moment about the applicative head and see what kind of evidence there is for this. Chingoni is a language spoken by the Gingoni people of Tanzania, Zambia, and Mozambique. It is a Bantu language, and like many Bantu languages, they have a particular alternation that shows up. So the sentence in A is a fairly straightforward transitive verb. The guest is buying the beer. Now, it is possible to make this a benefactive construction. And the benefactive construction involves this morpheme called an applicative, again glossed here as Appl. Now, it's the IL morpheme in the middle of the verb. Now, what you will notice about the B sentence is there's an additional argument. There's the Bantu. And the presence of this is only possible if you have the applicative morpheme in the verb. So this is an item that is tied to adding an argument to this sentence. So this element here adds in a benefactive. The presence of this benefactive element is only possible when this morpheme is here. Now in English, you will notice there's actually two ways to indicate a benefactive. You can say the guest is buying beer for the people, but you can also say the guest is buying people beer. This is another kind of double object construction. And just like the guest gave the people beer, people would be a goal. Here it's a benefactor. But again, its presence in Chingoni is reliant upon this functional head. Now remember, we argued that agents are sort of separated from the verb structure by virtue of, in languages like Japanese and Hyaki and Turkish and Malagasy, there's a morpheme that's present when you have an agent. And that morpheme we called voice. Well, here's the same thing. We have a morpheme that shows up when we have an extra argument. So let's propose that in fact we have Appl. The arguments for AgrIO are trickier, but just as a matter of parsimony in our theory, we're going to argue that in order for these sentences to be grammatical, or we're going to claim, I should say, that these items are going to be grammatical, there has to be a case licensing position for them as well, which we will identify as AgrIOP. Okay, we're going to do a tree for a double object verb that uses Appl, AgrIOP, and we're also going to have AgrOP in there as well, and voice. So this tree is pretty complex. So take a deep breath. We're going to walk through it. There's only one new bit to it, but when you put it together with all the other stuff, it looks a little intimidating, but it's really quite straightforward. So we'll start at the bottom of the tree, and this is material you have already seen before. So here we have a VP with a verb like give, and this VP takes as its sole argument a theme, which appears here. Notice the goal is actually not part of this structure anymore. Then this theme cannot get case in this position. This is not a case position. We've argued that instead the case position for accusative case is in the specifier of AgrOP. So this DP is going to move into the specifier of AgrOP in order to check its accusative case. Now, in order to get the word order right, we have to get the verb before this guy. So it's going to undergo short verb movement to Agaro, and actually it's going to keep moving on up the tree as well. So that's old hat. We've done that already. We've done this before when we looked at object shift. The next bit of the tree is new. So this is where we have the Appl phrase. Now, the Appl phrase is motivated by languages like Chingoni and other languages that overtly express a morphology that introduces indirect objects or benefactives or goals or whatever you like. So here's our applicative morpheme, and it is going to introduce the goal. Just like voice introduces agents, Appl introduces goals. So that's introduced into the structure. And above Appl, we have an AgrIO, and the AgrIO is where dative case, or if you in English, dative case and accusative case are identical. The second accusative case will be here. And so this DP will move into the specifier of AgrIO for case checking. This is exactly parallel to what happened downstairs. And a DP gets its theta here and its case here. Here it's getting its theta roll here and its case here. Now again, in order to get the right word order, goal is going to have to keep climbing up the tree via short verb movement. You'll notice it's happening here in 4 steps. That is because of the minimal link condition, which says you have to jump in short hops. So it's undergoing head to head to head to head movement. So that's why there are 4 hops. And the verb give is going to show all the way up here. So it'll be gave Ayumi the tape recorder. Now the rest of this tree is also something you've seen before. So that 0 active is a voice head. That voice head introduces the agent theta roll. The agent theta roll, this is not a case position, so it has to move, and it moves to the specifier, the TP, in order to get nominative case and check the EPP as well. So this is quite a complex derivation. Everything is moving. It would be even more exciting if it was a question. But it will result in the right word order, and it will result in the right properties that meet our conditions on well-formedness of a sentence. So every DP will have a theta roll, and every theta roll, every DP will also have a case. Those two things are not identical. The case positions are not the same as the thematic positions, but we can still result in the correct word order. Deep breaths.